Hello, Dan Humberg here, harvestfires.com. We are making an installation video to help anybody that's installing the tin work for a Firestop system. In this case, the model that we're installing for is a case 8010. Pretty sure that the exact same engine configuration exists in the earlier model 8120s prior to the model 11 year. So if you have a model 10, 9 or whatever of a 8120, I believe that this installation will be the same on that set of combines. But I have a couple of requests for 8010s this year, and so I have a new set of tin. It's designed on a CAD system. It's not bad, it works pretty well, but this is the first combine that I've fitted on, and anytime you do that the first time after having measured and as best you can the engine and its different components and the spatial location of everything, and then do the CAD design, you'll find that there's some places where it doesn't fit completely, and so I've had to do some trimming and cutting and pasting to make the tin fit around the components, and I'll try and point those out when we get to those in the video. Hopefully the ones that you get will have been corrected and cut later with a CAD file that doesn't have these in it, but if you get one of the ones that's this fall, they may have these special custom cuts, call it, on the tin pieces. Before we go any farther, I want to say that this system protects a combine in volatile crops like sunflowers from fires that occur at the turbocharger and the exhaust manifold and the first piece of the exhaust pipe. It does a good job of that. We keep clean air, filtered air pumped under pressure around those hot components so that no dust can get to them to ignite, and it does stop those endemic fires that occur rapidly and frequently in those crops when they're in a volatile condition. I have to warn you that this system will not stop all fires on all combines. Fires can occur from hot bearings, from electrical shorts, from a failed alternator, from a rock throwing a spark, to a variety of different things that can cause ignition. And so I can't say that I'm going to prevent every fire on your combine, but it will stop those things that seem to be unique to volatile crops like flowers, where the dust ignites at the turbocharger and the exhaust manifold and that first piece of exhaust pipe. So we're going to install the tin here to enclose that so that we can pump clean air into it. I'm going to show you some of the tools and stuff we're going to use first. Most of the tin is held together with these square drive screws. They have a square socket head. They're a self-drilling, self-tapping screw, although most of the holes here have been cut by the laser when the parts were cut out, and hopefully they match. If they don't, you can shoot a screw through where you need to by just, if you have enough resistance on this tin, you can shoot it through by just using a cordless drill and forcing it to cut its hole and cut the matching hole and thread it. But they're square drive screws. Number two square drive is the name of the screwdriver or whatever. So I have a plain screwdriver here. I have about a 6-inch long driver bit that comes in handy sometimes. I have a cordless DeWalt, mine's DeWalt, you can use whatever you want, cordless drill with a short driver bit that I use very frequently. And I have a custom made long driver bit that is about nearly a foot long. There are some times when you can't reach it any other way, and that's about the best way to do it. I haven't made up a whole lot of these, but I may make some up and ship some with you, send you one with a kit. If I don't, you can make one yourself. This is electric fence rod is what it was made out of. I just drilled a hole in the end and press fit the driver bit in there with a little bit of epoxy at the same time, and then holds it in there, and it drives screws just fine. The last one of those driver bits is a little stubby one, and there are some of the screws that there's no other way to get them in and out but with this stubby bit. That's a custom made one as well, and I try to put one of these in a kit. If you're buying 3 kits, I'll probably give you one of them, but if you're buying a single kit, I'll try and put one in there because you're going to need that. There's some screws that there's no way to get at it other than to reach behind or underneath and use this thing, and you have no room for the rest of the handle or a driver or anything else. All square drive. I like them because the screws stay on the bit. If you get it on there, it'll actually stay on there, and you can reach behind or underneath, whatever, and find the hole and get it started in there, and it won't fall off the way a Phillips screw or others do. The thing I'll point out is there's a big piece of red sheet metal that was here when we started, In my case, it's up here on top of the over by the radiators. It's sitting on top of the machine right now. But that piece of metal was mounted here with the screw up here above the exhaust part over here, and with a third one down here on the radiator housing bolts there. 3 bolts hold it on. It's a little bit tricky to get that off, but you need to take that off at the beginning. You need to take those 3 bolts off, and then you need to loosen this rubber grommet fitting that holds these coolant overflow lines. You need to loosen this up enough so that you can take the bottom one out of that grommet, because you need that out in order to get that red piece out. There's no way to snake that red piece out of here without taking this out. And then put it back in there and tighten that grommet up. There's 2 grommets. There's one here, and there's one over here behind the coolant overflow tank. You got to loosen them both up to get this out of there, so that you can get that red air shield. It's actually an air shield that directs air at the turbocharger and the exhaust manifold. That's okay if you don't have this system in place. They want to try and flush the dust off of those components. In the case of sunflowers, you're just going to be throwing that volatile dust right at the thing that's igniting those particles. So we don't want to do that. We want that red piece to come off, and it stays off as long as you have this installation in place. It interferes with this, and it doesn't help in this case anyway. We've already got this boxed in where we need to. So take that shield off, leave it off. You might want to keep it if you pass the combine on to somebody else, but take it off for the life of this installation anyway. You're looking down onto the exhaust manifold and the turbocharger and the exhaust pipe, and here's the compressed air, the pressurized air over on this side. The engine and valve cover are up this direction from you, and I'm sitting down in the hole between the grain tank and this engine. You might note the hat I was wearing. It's not that I wear the hat because it looks so amazingly cool. I wear the hat because it's an early warning system that I'm about to hit my head on something hard and uncomfortable, and you might choose to do something like that yourself, because there's a lot of things in here that are not real forgiving when you have to bend over and pick up something that you drop. Okay, we want to enclose the exhaust manifold against the engine, so we want to pin this against the engine block and keep it not airtight, but at least tight enough that we can force clean air into there. And then we need to enclose the turbocharger here, and I want to enclose this first piece of exhaust pipe. It comes out about 18 inches and then angles up and goes to the muffler over on this side of the machine. So we can start with, I actually have some pieces pre-assembled, and you can do the same thing. I have another video that will show you how to fold up these pieces of tin from the flat pieces that the laser cut. And so what we have here is the very top piece. This is the top piece that's going to cover the exhaust manifold from one end to the other. It has 2 bolt holes. Actually, it has 3 bolt holes, but we really only need 2. There's one here that's very low down to the lid, and one over to the left here that both will match up to tapped holes that are unused in the head of the engine right above the exhaust manifold. And so those are a couple of bolts that we can use to hold that piece on. On the bench, before you ever get here, you can assemble that top piece to this chunk here. Sorry. This piece that covers the vertical face of the exhaust manifold. It's actually piece number 9. I believe this piece was number 1 in the count that we had when we did the folding process. But you can screw that together. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screw holes. I will note that this one on the end, I found that there's an interference with the bolt pattern on the top of the exhaust manifold, so you may not be able to use that screw hole. That doesn't really matter. It's not going to come apart without that one. But it won't fit down in place when I put that screw in there. I'll try and move that screw hole for future cuts of these. So you can screw that together, and you can put all of those screws in there. I don't have them all in because I have to take this apart when I'm done, so I only put enough in to hold it together. There's a matching piece on the other side that will screw to the flange on the top piece. You can put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws in that one and hold it in place and pre-assemble that before you ever get into the combine. It'll make it faster and easier. Then there are 2 pieces that fit on the upper sides of the turbo. This piece here, I forget what the number is on that piece. I believe it's number 4 in the list of parts. On my left, your right-hand side of the turbo will go right in between the turbo oil line and the compressor housing. And the matching piece on the other side will go on the outside of the turbocharger, my right, your left of the turbo here. Those pieces can be bolted, or not bolted, but screwed to the top piece right here and here. I also right now have this chunk on here, and that actually probably may not be there on your, this actually may be part of the piece that wraps all around the turbo. In this case there was an error in the CAD model, and the CAD model sliced this piece off. So I have a couple of splice chunks here to be able to attach it to these side pieces. In your case, the side pieces may not be connected here right away, and this piece may not go on initially. But in my case, I could screw that on ahead of time and attach it to these side pieces. Otherwise, the piece that wraps around here would come later. So those can be attached. These side pieces can be attached with it. Even if it's just a single screw, it'll work right here. And the one on this side, there's 2 screws there, and you could put those in ahead of time. I've only got 1 on here right now, but you could put both of those in. I will point out that on this piece, there's a kind of what looks like a sloppy cut here. There was a laser cut there, but it's very difficult to predict exactly where this oil line is going to be in space when you're trying to measure this, and when you don't know exactly where your piece of tin is going to go. So I took a stab at it with the computer and cut a oblong hole through here and a slot down here so we can split this apart to go over that oil line. Turns out that this piece settles down a little farther down, and I had to open this up a little bit more. That's not a big problem. It'll be necessary in some cases anyway. But what I want to point out is that when you open something up, if you have to adjust by cutting and bending tin here to fit around that oil line, make sure you bend the pieces so that they are parallel to the oil line, and so that they rest on it and you don't have a sharp edge resting on that oil line, because if that vibrates on there, we could possibly eventually cut through that oil line, or the 2 could interfere with each other to the point where we could have a problem. If it's a flat piece of face of tin sitting on there, I don't think it will ever bother anything. So in my case, I've bent this out, and that will rest on top of that oil line. These other pieces are far enough away from it that I don't believe that they're going to interfere or be a problem with it. Now we'll split this whole chunk on. I also will point out that I had to trim enough of an error in measurement of the center line of this turbo and stuff that when I put this on here, it didn't fit, and I ended up cutting additional metal out of this to fit around that turbo bearing area. That's not a problem in that this whole thing is going to fit tight up against the turbo face here, or the compressor housing face, and so it's not going to leak a lot, even though I made the hole bigger. That's not an issue. On the other side, on the exhaust side of the exhaust turbine, I also had to open this part of it up a little bit here, make this hole, move it forward essentially, move it this direction closer to the manifold in order for this to fit. And I just did that by testing and testing and cutting and testing. Now this is about right, and I'll try and correct that in the CAD models for future cuts of this, but you could get one like this where you'd have to cut that additional metal out. If it doesn't fit, try and figure out where your interference is, and you can take small amounts of metal off in order to, with a tin snips, in order to make it fit. But hopefully we'll get this so that they fit when they get to you. Okay, let's see if we can put this piece in place. You get the whole chunk, you slip it back in over the manifold, and the key is when you get down to the oil line that serves the turbocharger bearing, you have to split those 2 flanges. I'm going to move you over to the side here a little bit more. So you have to split these flanges apart, so one goes on each side of that, and it'll drop down in place here. In fact, that dropped right where it needs to fall. It's sitting down where it belongs now. There, that was it. That little piece on up against that turbo compressor housing is stuck. I'm going to push on that and flatten that just a little bit there. There, gives it a little bit more freedom. So that sits in place there. You could put the bolts, the two bolts here and over there in place and bolt that on right now. It actually probably will help to have this loose for a little while, so I wouldn't necessarily do that. But this is going to fall down, and it'll actually sit on top of the where the bolts hold on the manifold onto the head. That's where it's resting right now, and that's all right. It can sit on there. It won't bother anything. So we've got that much in place. That's a boost to get that much in started right away. Then the next two pieces that we want to put in place are the pieces that fill in the underside underneath the exhaust manifold, left and right sides. We start with a short piece. This piece goes like this, matches the left hand, my left hand, your right hand. This is the radiator fan over here, that end of the engine. And this has another piece, number 11, that is screwed to it. And you can screw that on ahead of time if the holes are drilled for it. If for some reason you get one where there aren't holes there, then you have to fit this piece in, fit this up against underneath it, and make sure that the slot matches up with a threaded boss in the engine block, and then mark those holes and punch them. But hopefully they come to you pre-drilled or pre-cut, so that you can just slap this on there, this L-shaped bracket, match up the holes, screw it on, and you're good to go. Once you have that on in place, this piece can go in from you have to go around underneath the intake compressed air line, slide this under. I'm going to pull it out for just a second and point out how it works. This edge has flanges that are bent down and flanges that are not bent or just stay straight with the piece. These flanges that are bent down will butt up against a raised casting boss that's in the block, side of the engine block, and they'll keep it from going in too far. These rest on the top of that casting boss, and there's kind of a slot there where the head starts, and so these will sit on top of that boss and extend a little ways into that slot. So they keep it from moving up and down. These bump up against that boss, and the clamp here on the bottom holds the whole thing against the engine. It'll be the same on the other side, on the opposite end of the manifold with that piece. So it's a puzzle. You fit this in there, and you have to work it up over that casting boss in order to get it to lock in place. Once it's there, you kind of feel it. You feel it fall into place, and in fact it fits there and should behave. If once you have it in the right spot, you should be able to line up the screw holes from this front face with the matching holes on the bottom piece. I'm going to put a couple of screws in this, but I won't put them all in here because I have to take this back apart as soon as I get done putting it on. You can put screws in every hole that you can reach. You may find that there are some holes on the tin in places that you just flat out can't reach with any of the screwdrivers or driver bits that we've got here. That may be okay. You don't necessarily have to have a screw in every hole to hold it together, but you want as many as you can possibly reach. Some of them are put in there on the CAD model. It's pretty easy to put holes in on the CAD model sometimes, and you don't have pieces like this in the way, and so you think, well, that'd be a good place for a screw hole, but when in practical application you can't actually reach it with a screw or with a driver to get at. But most of them you can, and so put all of the screws in you can while you're assembling that. So now we have the piece under the left side. At this point I could, and I probably will, take one of these 8mm, it takes a 13mm wrench, so you've got a 13mm socket wrench on hand. You come underneath, and that little tab that we screwed onto that piece has a slot in it, and that slot will match up right over the top of a open hole in a raised cylindrical boss on the block. And you can put that in. I won't make mine real tight because again I'm all temporary, but you can thread that one in and tighten it up. Before you put one in there, if you've got compressed air anywhere, you want to blast that hole out with compressed air because it will be full or halfway full of chaff, dust, dirt, and it's really hard to get that bolt in there. It does not want to go in when there's dirt in there. And so blast that hole out before you put this on. In fact, that'd be one operation before you even start is find those holes in the block that you're going to use, these up here, left and right sides, blast them out to get the dirt and dust out of them, and maybe put a drop of oil in them. It'll go a lot easier when you get to those bolts then. So now we go to the next piece of tin. It looks like this. Actually fits like this end. It's going to go under my right, your left side of the exhaust manifold and fill in. It actually overlaps the previous piece that we just put in here. That one should be the bottom one. This should slip in above that one, and so you have larger pilot holes in the bottom piece and small pilot holes here for the screws to bite in. And if you've assembled this ahead of time on the bench, those are already threaded. The only way to get that screw in is to reach under that with that little stubby screwdriver and screw those two in. But it's nice to tie the whole thing together left and right. I also have on the right hand end another bracket that screws on right here. 4 holes here, they're laser cut. 4 holes in this bracket that folds up, screws on there. But I wouldn't screw that on until after you have this in place. It's just it's very difficult to get it in place with this already on there. So wait until that's not in place before we put that bracket on. Okay, this one you can snake in from the exhaust end side of the engine. Close. Close. There it went. You have to, that's why I keep this end of the top piece loose until we get these things in place, because it's easier. You can twist it a little bit and get this flange tucked up underneath there, and when you get it there, it'll be a little floppy, but you can tell it's in the right spot, and then the holes should line up so we can put some screws in here. Okay, now I'm going to probably skip some steps in the interest of time. Maybe I'll put this in with 1 screw. I've got 4 screws here, and I have to find the spot where this goes in on the bottom of here. Actually, to do that, it's best to squat down in this hole so you can get underneath the manifold and see what you're doing. If you know a leprechaun, you might hire him to do this for you, because it's just a whole lot easier if somebody's really little. But there's one, and I could put the other 4 screws in there, and the hole in the block lines up nicely with the slot in that bracket, and then we can take a, if I can reach it, somewhere up there is, here's a 8mm bolt, 13mm socket. We'll thread into the boss on the casting, and you can tighten that up and it will hold this against the block. At this point, you could also put the bolts in on the top of the piece to hold it against the block. That's in tight, and this is fairly rigid now. That brings us to the next piece. The next 2 pieces we're going to put on, because we have the exhaust manifold boxed in here now. The next 2 pieces are the bottom halves of the turbocharger cover. The left, my left, and the other, and the exhaust side covers for that turbo. What do they look like? This is the one that's going to go in here between the compressor housing and the turbo. I had to trim on this one a little bit. The original cut was there. I had to trim here a little bit deeper because this came up farther to fit around the bottom of the turbo bearing area, right in against that face. Now this one's a little challenging to get in there. It will fit. Sorry. I'll tell you, it will fit. And so you just have to be persistent about finding the combination that makes it go in there. You might want to take a couple ibuprofen before you climb in here. This is kind of a good practice. Oh look, while I was fooling around, this piece fell into place. That's good. So that has a flange that comes up against the outside of this face that we've already screwed in place. And if I'd tightened up the bolt on the bottom, that'd be a little bit firmer, but I haven't done that yet. Anyway, there's a couple of bolt holes there or screw holes, I'm sorry, that you can put screws in to pull that wide flange up against that face. There's a little tab on the bottom that covers up a little gap because I'm using this tin on more than one model, there's some set variations. That just covers up a little bolt hole or a gap that was there. This one we have a single screw. This is one of the few times we screw from the inside of the kit to the outside, where these two pieces overlap. Out here on the outside, you can get a screw through to hold it together, maybe. But there's not really room to get the screwdriver from the outside here because the compressor is in the way. And so you can put that screw through from the inside while we have access to it with a 6-inch driver or the long driver, or any of those will work. Okay, that one, and then I'll pivot this one up and I will put one screw in there to hold that in place if possible. There is also one screw hole right down here underneath, right behind the oil, the pressure oil line for the turbo bearing. And you can reach that one with the long driver bit and a screw over from behind the exhaust pipe over here. You can thread that up in there. In there without the drill driver, so we'll switch bits here momentarily. And then reach up, and I'm doing this at an angle, so it's trying to drive the screw at a little bit of an angle, but that's okay. So I got one screw, you can see it came through on this side right by the oil line, and it helps hold that piece together. Actually, you need it to be positioned in there so it'll hold while we do this assembly, but once we wrap steel and screw it on all around this turbocharger, that really locks a lot of things together here, and maybe we got more screws than we need, but I like to have those positioned tightly before we do that. Next piece is the bottom right hand side, or your left, but around the exhaust pipe. Again, here I had to cut a little bit of additional metal out here, and I'll try and fix that on later editions of this. It fits inside of the top piece. Both of these bottom pieces fit on the inside of the upper halves. And when we get it positioned up there, so that the screw holes that you've pre-threaded line up, we can start a screw in here on the outside. It only needs this one right here for now, and then I'll put one in the inside as well. Let's see, here's my driver. And there are two holes that also match up in the face of this manifold cover in the side flange of this, and you can put, I'll probably put one screw in there, but you'd put both of those in, and that will lock it to that manifold cover. So now we've covered the sides of the turbo. The next exciting step is to cover the rest of the turbo. And for that we have this large piece It's really just a long strip, but it's got perforated lines that match up to the corners of these. Again, on the next iteration of the cuts that we do, or next ones that I manufacture of this piece here with the hole in for the air intake will actually be connected to this. It'll all be part of the same thing, and it will wrap all the way around here and then go on to this top. So, but that got cut off in this particular run. Okay, this will slide in from the exhaust pipe in. You got to be below the exhaust pipe and on top of this coolant line, and it will slide in there. And before I do that, I'm going to point out that the oil return from the turbo bearing has to go straight down out of the turbo bearing. That's about a 3/4 inch hard line, and there's a notch in the bottom piece here that the bottom side of this cover. For that to go out, it's a notch in the flange, and in the case of the notch in the flange, I bend the edges of that notch upward so that it's parallel to the line, so that it can't abrade the line or damage it. It's running parallel to it then on both sides. It'll open up that hole a little bit more. That's okay. And in the same way, this one will overlap that flange like this, and these edges I bent downward. Opened them up a little bit and bent them downward, so again they're parallel to the line, and they're smooth against the line now. I made it a little bit more open than it needed to be. This doesn't need to be quite this wide here. I did have to move it forward a little bit because that line in this case was a little bit that way, and so but I've got a little gap here. It doesn't really hurt, but I like to keep it as close around that as is possible. It's going to have to leak air out of this box anyway, but I don't want it all to fall out, or all the air to leak out in just a couple of holes. You want it to leak out in a variety of places. Forces air to go to all parts of the assembly. Okay, we can come in here. And the holes should line up. So I'm going to start with one here. This could also, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to back it out and show that though. It is also possible that this could go under these two tabs, but again, those tabs won't be there in yours probably because this will all be part of this piece. So I'm just going to put it over the top here. Now, I'm going to try and change the camera angle a little bit here because we're getting a lot of sun glare at this point. I don't know if we're going to be able to get away around that. The sun is just shining right over my shoulder here, and there's not much I can do. I'll keep at it. Okay, so we're going to put a few screws in this to hold it together. You would put all of the screws in this. And I'm going to go down underneath and put a few screws in down on the bottom. You won't be able to see that I'm not putting them all in, but you should put all your screws in there to hold it tightly together. Here's my stubby bit. Okay, I'm going to go down and put a couple more in to hold this together. I was going to say, if you're doing an 80-10, the good news is that this is actually one of the easier exhaust systems to fit around. The bad news is that easy is kind of a relative term. Alright, so we've got this boxed in. The next thing we're going to treat is the exhaust pipe. We've got this long section and then a shorter section off to the end here to cover. And so this first piece is going to go on the bottom. It's actually, it says bottom outside number 13 is cut into it. It is the bottom of the exhaust system. That tells us that that was the outside to help with folding it up. And the piece was number 13. Okay. Now I had to move the holes that hold this on because I told you earlier that the alignment or my measurement for the center line of this was off by probably about 5/8 of an inch. I'm not quite sure how we did that, but that means that the holes that we pre-cut on the flanges to attach this exhaust piece really don't line up. It would shove this tight up against the exhaust pipe on one side, so I'm shifting it. Hopefully the ones you get will either be pre-cut correctly or I will have modified the design and fixed that issue. But there's about 10 or more screws in the flange that hold this piece up against the face of the turbo cover here and give us a lower channel to cover that exhaust pipe. And again, I put in a couple. You'll put in a whole boatload of screws there, but that'll hold it for now. This is the top half of that system, and this overlaps as a flange here and a flange here, both of which overlap the sides of the piece we just put in place. You slip it over there, bring it back up against the turbo cover. But you will do two things. You will put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, eventually 6 screws through the side, this side, and probably a matching number through the other side to hold these two halves together, and then there will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws that hold it to the face of the turbo cover. You know, a useful tool here might be a scratch awl, where you can put the hole through one and hole the pilot hole and find the other one and line that up while you put a screw in another hole, a neighboring one. There, I think I got one. Okay, sorry for the delay. Let's see whether I can put one more in now that I got one. Usually you get one in, then the others are aligned because they're all laid out to match on the computer. And in fact, that's the case. Once I got one in, the rest of them lined up. So that first one is tricky, but the rest will go. Okay, so I've got 4 screws holding this 2 halves together. You can squish this a little bit if necessary to make it fit a little bit better around that exhaust pipe. It's a matter of how you bent it when you formed it up. It should be like an octagon to fit around the exhaust pipe. And the next 2 pieces, and actually the last 2 pieces of this part of the assembly. This one is the top. I had to cut a little bit around this side, I believe, to fit around a bracket up there. I'll take it back. Oh, yep. These are not top and bottom. These are inside and outside. And so this piece will fit on the other side. This piece will fit here, and in fact that one goes right there. I hope you can see this. Should check that occasionally, I suppose. Okay, so 2 screws on this top center part of the octagon. We'll hold that in place. There's more around on the back flanges or the overlapping flanges to hold it in place. I'm going to put those two in, and then this piece will overlap or underlap. It actually goes under the other one on top of the exhaust pipe. And I had to trim on this one, actually both of them. I had to trim here to fit around the mounting bracket that holds that exhaust pipe in place, and this one around the lower bracket down below. This upper one is kind of a band clamp arrangement. Down here there's a supporting welded on, I think, a welded support that comes up here, and I had to trim around that. I'll try and cut those. I'll try and build that into the CAD model in the future. Okay, now I'll put one more screw in here. There are screws on the top and the sides here. There are actually screws on this seam, this overlapping seam here, and there are a matching set of holes, a couple of them anyway, left on the back side, and you can screw it together on the back as well. You don't really need to do that to teach you how to do it, but they're there, they line up. It is also true that these holes right now are right on top of the exhaust pipe, and so they're going to encounter that exhaust pipe, and I'm not sure that I don't think it's an issue. They'll actually stand it off when you put the screw in. It'll probably hit the exhaust pipe and back the tin off a little bit from the exhaust pipe, which is okay. I don't think it'll hurt the exhaust pipe. But anyway, and there's these fingers that are bent to fit up against the exhaust pipe as well. They don't go 90 degrees in, they just bend in a little bit because they're really resting on this band clamp now rather than on the pipe itself. They were designed to go in against the pipe, but the clamp is in the way. So this whole thing is relatively rigid now, and so we're just about, we're pretty much done with the tin part. Okay, I'm going to put you here, and I know we got a lot of glare here. I'm sorry about that. Not too much I can do about it. The sun's shining here. I don't have the keys to move the machine. Okay, the last thing is to connect up the air line where we're going to bring in the clean air. And this has to go out over the top of the exhaust, or not exhaust, sorry, right over the top of the valve cover. You're upside down looking at it here, but we've got the engine valve cover right in front of us here. And so I've temporarily stuck a 4-inch rubber elbow that will go into 4-inch aluminum pipe that we duct the air in with, and this I want to shoot straight over the top of the valve cover with that 90, and I'm hooked on to a 4-inch furnace type elbow with the flex adjustments, and on the bottom of that elbow I cut tabs up about a ½ an inch in. Should do a little bit better job of this on the next one, but measure up there, put a line around there, ½ inch, cut tabs about 3/4 of an inch wide all around up to that line. Then we'll bend some of them out and some of them not. If you look down here, you'll see that we've got the exhaust turbocharger connection joint to the exhaust manifold right here, and it's only about 1/4 of an inch underneath this flange, so we really can't put a tab down there. It'll hit that. So in those places we'll leave the tabs poking out. Other places we'll alternate one and the other and put some tabs down in and some tabs out. But the point is, we're able to slip those tabs into the hole. There's a 4-inch hole cut in the tin. And if you do that, you can rest it down in there tight against the tabs that are bent out 90 degrees. And now at this point I would take the rubber elbow off. And what you do then is reach in through this 90 with your fingers, bend the tabs out that were poking down in there, bend them out underneath this surface so that their resistance to it pulling out. You want to bend as many of them out under there. I'd probably have more on the inside if I could than on the outside, but you can put some in the inside and leave some on the outside like we've got here.
reach in and bend those as tight as you can out against the inner surface of the housing. And the outer ones here, you don't have to do it with all of them, but with some of them, I would take the drill driver and maybe a 6-inch bit and shoot a screw through this tab and into the housing, through the housing. So you've got maybe 4 screws holding 4 of these tabs tight down to the housing. And then the rest of them can be pressed to fit up against the housing. And the last thing I would do in the entire installation here is to come back around with, I'm going to provide a roll of aluminum foil tape, duct-like tape, but aluminum foil tape, and take some pieces of that aluminum foil tape. And I usually, when I do an installation, put it around here to help seal this up, for one thing, because we've got some little gaps here. And I don't want to lose air here because that hasn't done us any good yet. We want to get that air into the housing. Once it's in the housing, I don't really care if it leaks out along the seams and stuff like that, or in little gaps. It needs to leak out. In fact, we put trap doors in here in places so that we can open these up and allow air to come to the end of the manifold and flow out. But here, it hasn't done us any good yet, so you want to try and seal this up with that aluminum foil tape. And it's pretty good sticky stuff, and it bends to fit the shape. It's a good product for that. I would also use that aluminum foil tape, take strips of it and wrap it around these joints once you have this in the position you want. In my case, I want to move it before I tighten it in place. I want to move it so that I'm pointing that 90-degree elbow out where I want the air line to come in, and right across the top of the valve cover. And you got to go around the oil fill cap on the valve cover. So we push this in place, lock that in place, put some tape around the base of it to seal it up and hold it in tight. And then we put a strip around each one of these joints to tighten those up. Then you probably need to shoot 2 or 3 screws through the rubber and through the aluminum or the steel, galvanized steel duct piece here. You might want to drill a few holes ahead of time in that rubber because it doesn't drill really easily. And then put some screws through there to hold it tightly to this, and then I would also wrap aluminum tape around the junction between the rubber fitting and the furnace fitting here. Once you've done that, you actually have the whole installation in place on there, and you should be boxed in and tight. You might want to go back and check that you've gotten all of the screws that you can possibly reach to get them screwed in so it's really tightly put together and rigid. I would also use some of that aluminum tape. I would take long strips of it and cover the rows of screws, for instance, on the turbo cover and on the long pieces that cover the exhaust manifold, and put them over those corners and cover the rows of screws. Now, it's not so much that you want to seal it up. That's okay. It doesn't hurt to seal it up there because we'll let air out these other holes. But what you're really doing is kind of putting a Loctite on top of the screws. The screws are sheet metal screws, and this thing's going to vibrate. They could vibrate loose. If you don't have anything holding them down, they could vibrate loose to the point where they just rattle out and drop out, and pretty soon we got our housing coming apart. With that aluminum tape stuck down tight over the top of those screws and pasted to the galvanized material, I don't think those screws, even if they come a little bit loose, they won't be able to spin backward and get out, and they've got adhesive on top of them keeping them from spinning. So cover a number of those, or the easily accessed ones anyway, with a strip of that aluminum tape. Last thing, again, as I began the video, I will caution you that combines can catch fire for a variety of reasons, and so you could still have hot bearings or other hot components. There are some other exhaust components that we're not treating that on some machines tend to run hot, like a diesel particulate filter or diesel exhaust catalyst. This installation does not affect those, but it does seem to stop the ignition of volatile dust on the machines that we've put it on. So good luck with your installation. And again, this kit fits on an 8010, and hopefully would also fit on an earlier model 8120 from Model 10 or earlier.